Hi, everybody. I'm super excited to talk to you about this topic and to get started. Sorry, I'm getting my computer set up. Yeah, so my name's Treyce. I'm a product designer here at Carbon 5. I've worked here for about 4 years, and I've worked on a really large range of projects in that time, ranging from like large financial institutions to startups who are just cutting their teeth. And I found that using an experiment-driven process has been really helpful to all of those companies and all those different stages. A little bit about Carbon 5. So Carbon 5 is a digital product development consultancy. We have software development, product designers, and product managers, and we feel that those three disciplines working together can build and create really, really great companies and products for our clients. So just to dive right in here, what is experiment-driven design? I like to define it as a design process that's optimized for learning over delivering. Another sort of more verbose way to put that is to build a product to learn if users and businesses would benefit from that product, right? So I think if you think of traditional sort of like agile methods, lean startup or design thinking and human-centered design, a lot of those processes are optimized for delivering something at the end and for creating sort of a product that you will launch. I think of experiment-driven design as a way to do that as well, but a process in which that optimized learning about your users and your business and your market, rather than sort of making a bigger bet and launching something using one of the other processes. Things that make it different are there's a lot more emphasis on iterations and quantity rather than quality necessarily. So in doing experiment-driven design, you want to be putting lots and lots of ideas out there and measuring their success. So that leads perfectly into testing early and often. Every sort of iteration, every idea that you have in experiment-driven design, you will want to test and be able to measure that impact, right? So in experiment-driven design, when you measure that impact, you want to be able to measure the user impact that it has and the business impact. So is it solving the problems for your users? Are you creating something that they will love and they will continue to engage with over time? But also, is the thing you're making going to help your business grow? Are you going to be able to monetize it? Are you going to be able to scale it? Are you going to be able to it as time? I think a large variety of teams can benefit from this process too. Core product, obviously, I think if you are launching like a new type of service, I think this process can really help a core product team understand what you might want to launch. A brand team can totally use this process to test different types of campaigns or different copy for customers. And obviously, I think the team that takes the most advantage of this is a growth team trying to provide more value and re-engage customers. So we've at Carbon 5 found that this process can really help two types of projects, no matter what type of company it is. So a client that wants to build a new product or service can really, really benefit from using an experiment-driven design approach, or a project that is more about growth design or growth hacking. So a project that is trying to optimize or provide additional value to a product or service that already exists. And I'm going to be going over sort of methods that we use in either type of project, both at a pretty high level example. So if anyone has like more detailed questions, I'd be happy to answer those at the end. Cool, so phase one, I divide the process up into 3 phases. Again, this is super high level. I think if you get really deep into like lean startup or growth design and growth hacking, they have many more steps and they have much more sort of like fine grain processes. And I'm sort of giving a much higher overview of both of those 2 things in this talk. So phase one, I call understand and strategize. So you're going to want to find out what you need to learn, how you're going to learn it, and how you're going to measure the success of what you've learned and sort of synthesize your learnings. So we find one really great way to do that, especially for companies that are just starting out, is to use the lean canvas, which is a very similar concept to a business model canvas, with a couple key differences. And to use this as a way to iterate and then sort of test those iterations out, right? So here you sort of define your business in many different sections, such as key metrics, problem, solution, unique value proposition. And it's really easy for a business to sit down and fill out as many of these as you can, and then iterate based on what you filled out, right? Or create a landing page for each different business idea you've defined using this method. Another great way, if you're trying to go sort of the growth hacking and growth design path, is using an experiment plan. I find these super necessary if you're going to be launching any sort of like multivariant testing or A/B testing, and it's similar to the lean canvas in that it's like a little worksheet that you fill out, and it helps you define what you're going to test and then how you're going to measure it, right? So there's a hypothesis, there's an audience, there's key metrics, and then when you're done, you actually go back and refill this worksheet out so you can record the results and what you're going to explore next based on those results. This is an example from a project that I did a couple years ago of a lean canvas that we did. We actually printed it out really large and then got it laminated. We taped it up in our workroom, and we just started filling it out with stickies with our client. They were a startup that was in the sports space, and they needed to sort of scope down what they were going to build first. And we were using this as a way to test with customers what scope they would want to launch into the market first. Another sort of real world example where Carbon 5 is used, the lean canvas, is with a project we did with Nissan, and we were prototyping the future of car ownership and exploring what it might look like when car ownership goes beyond just personal. This was sort of in a moment in the market where sort of like shared services were very popular, and we used the lean canvas a lot to understand different business models we could approach and different value propositions that we might launch to their customers. Well, okay, into it. Phase 2 is more of the tactical phase. So I call this design and develop. So after you sort of strategized using those frameworks, the lean canvas or the experiment plan, I think the best way to approach experiment-driven design is to design every iteration you possibly could, and be very detailed in that iterating, right? You're going to want to make sure like all your I's are dotted and all your T's are crossed. You're going to want to make sure that every time you sort of have a new variation in mind, that you draw it out. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to launch each iteration that you come up with, but it's really important to go very wide and have a good breadth of ideas here that then you can move forward and test with users or launch in the market. So specifically, if you're doing sort of like growth design and growth hacking, one really important thing to do is to launch every variation of a test. If you sort of launch a big new test, like in an A/B style fashion, and you have one landing page and then a very drastically different landing page, and one performs better than the other, it will be hard to know why. So the idea here is, after you've designed every iteration, to make sure you're launching the variations that will be able to tell you why one interface performs better than the other. This graphic is a very minimal example of like if you had a call to action on a mobile screen, and you wanted to test the position and the shape of that, you would want to make sure that you put the circle button in each different spot and the square button in all the same spots. And obviously there are more iterations you could do with this in the center or in different positions. You could also be testing color. Um, but I think it's very important to launch each variation. If you're doing more of like a new product approach and you're not thinking as detailed as this, I think it's still important using qualitative user research methods to show people every variation that you're talking about and get feedback as much as you can, so you can synthesize that into different measurements. So Carbon 5 used this method particularly in a project we did with a company called Joyable, which does online therapy. And we were testing onboarding flows and how to get people signed in and engaged with their mental health program they were going to do. And it was really important for us to design many screens, launch them all, see how they performed, but also show those screens to potential clients that we were going to have in our system using our product to get their written feedback or verbal feedback as well. We had a really great success with this project, and we learned particularly that if you're going to be focusing on a particular flow, like an onboarding flow, then you will want to really explore each option, like I've said before. Cool. Okay, we're moving right along here. So phase 3, I think is the most important phase, and I think where things can sort of get a little lost, particularly if you're managing multiple projects at a time, or how depending on like the allocation of your team, how many resources you have. But you're going to want to spend a fair amount of time reflecting and learning from everything that you had just launched and that you had just learned from. Right. So I think the best way to do it is with qualitative and quantitative learnings as much as you can. Right. There might be an experiment if you're using the Lean Canvas where you weren't able to really collect quantitative results, which is totally fine. But if you can do a mix of both, I think it's really important. So measure or reflect on the success of a user test or an experiment is using a retrospective style format, right? So sort of writing what you think went well, what you think didn't go so well, and then trying to come up with learnings from that, and then applying those learnings to your next test that you do. This is a picture, sort of an example of a collaborative retrospective where everyone's writing on stickies. Somebody is facilitating and putting those stickies up on a wall. We actually did a whole webinar about retrospectives that you can find on our website if you want to get more into that sort of method of reflecting. And then the other way is using, analytic software. So I have a picture of Amplitude here, which we're big fans of. You can also use something like Keep or Mixpanel to understand who made it through your funnel or who engaged with what features on your site. And I think it's important to not overlook sort of like cohorts in these tools. So in these tools, you can segment users by different attributes like device or location, and understanding, if Android users are doing something different than iOS users, or if mobile web users are doing something than desktop users. It can really help you optimize for the right design if you're tracking and measuring the success of the features that you're launching. The next thing that I think is really important is to go back and update these 2 worksheets that we talked about earlier. So if you filled out the lean canvas and then let's say you launched a sort of mock landing page, drove traffic to it to understand if people found sort of value in the business proposal that you had. If you have learnings from that, I think making another lean canvas or editing the one you've already made is really important to track your learnings as you go and to keep adjusting this sort of business model as much as you can. We like to sort of make them really big, like I had in that photo earlier, put them on the wall and have them up always so everyone on the team and additional stakeholders can see what you're doing. Here's a picture of sort of some rooms that we've had where we put like our winners and losers of experiments we've run, where we're doing all the concepting around those things and tracking the learnings that we had with the post-it notes over them. I think the more time it might sort of feel a little frivolous at first, you know, like it feels sort of like decorating your project room, but I think it can be really valuable, especially for people who aren't in the day-to-day of a project, to see an externalized version of the thoughts and the learnings that everyone has had on a project. So we really liked tracking the winners and losers on a project we did with Prosper a little while ago. It's a little bit of an older project. Where we helped them optimize their application flow. So Prosper is a financial company where you can get a personal loan. And we specifically helped them optimize on mobile because they were seeing that there was their funnel got slimmer on mobile than on desktop. And so we worked with them to understand why people weren't finishing an application on mobile and how we could help those people actually find the value in the product that they needed. Cool, so phase 4 is sort of summarizing everything up and putting it all together. It's really simple, you just rinse and repeat. You do it again. This cycle is meant to be super fast. And so the faster you can sort of come up with an idea and strategize about what you're gonna test, design all the iterations and variations that you need, put it in people's hands and see how they react, the more you're going to learn. And this process is optimized for learning, right? So at the end of an experiment or a test that you want to do, you might find that your idea didn't, have as strong of legs as you would have liked it to. And you might not launch that idea into the market at all, but you will take the learnings from that and apply it to your next test. I think I've seen teams sort of with the repetition of this process or the fast feedback loops of this process. I think at times, if you launch a couple of tests that don't do as well as you would have liked in a row, it can feel a little discouraging. And that's where I find the retrospectives and the learn phase really important, so that teams can all feel like they're being productive together rather than they're sort of seeing a series of failures. Cool. So, I did not necessarily invent this on my own. I've learned from a lot of wonderful talks, tools, articles. There's a lot of great resources out there. If you type in growth design or experiment-driven design, I have put sort of my best, my favorite links together for you guys that we'll share out in an email at the end. Two that I really want to call out is the talks, the two at the top, Designing for Growth and Practicing Growth Design, are 2 lectures that were given at conferences, and they are really spectacular and not only give a very high level overview, but give very concrete, detailed examples that we didn't get into in the webinar today. Cool. So I know we finished a little bit earlier and we have plenty of time for questions, and I would love to answer whatever anyone has.
Awesome, thank you, Treyce. So there are a few questions that came in during the presentation. So the first one, Alex asked, how much time does it typically take to run an experiment?
Cool, yeah. It's a great question, and it totally depends on what you're trying what you're trying to run. If you are launching real software into the world, like you have a website, or you are changing maybe the sign up flow on your mobile app, you're going to need to wait and have enough people go through your variations to achieve what's called statistical significance. And platforms like Optimizely and Amplitude have really great, like user-friendly ways to see when that might happen and how many more users need to go through something to achieve that statistical significance. So those like real software tests, I think, can take a little bit of time. If you're doing more like qualitative testing, and testing maybe just like a prototype or something, those I think can go much faster. One, you can totally use the people around you to test those things, or you can use a platform like usertesting.com, or there's another one called userinterviews.com, which are really great and can deliver you lots of participants very fast.
Awesome. Another question that came in is, how does this work for solo folks or smaller understaffed teams? What would some of those best practices be?
Totally. At Carbon 5, typically our team size is pretty lean. Like we do projects probably with between 3 and 5, maybe 6 resources, and that's spanned across product design and development, right? So if you're like a team of 1, I would say you are sort of more in charge of your own timeline, and I think it's probably like more of like how fast can you do it yourself? What blockers will you put in front of yourself? It also can be hard as a team of 1 because you won't have as much like ability to reflect as you would with a larger group. So I think if to answer your question more straightforward, if you're a small team, I think like dividing and conquering one task each at a time, like one experiment, working on each thing could be really good tactic, right? Like one designer works on one thing, one PM works on another thing, but then coming together for those pivotal moments of the like understanding and strategizing phase, and then the reflections and the learning phase, doing those two together as a team can be really important, but then splitting up the work in other ways.
Awesome. Another question that came in is, how do you communicate some of these strategies with people who are remote?
We do a lot of work with remote clients. I think there's plenty of like digital tools out there. We use one that we've built that is free to use for anyone, called Stickies.io, which is just a platform, like a digital whiteboard with sticky notes on it, and doing like your reflections or your strategizing in those types of remote collaboration tools is really, really helpful. That's one reason I'm a big fan of Figma, because you can draw a lean canvas in Figma and work on those collaboratively with people at the same time, and have like whole complete virtual project rooms if your team is distributed.
Great. Another question that came in, there are so many things that we could test. How do we figure out which things should we test? Should we just test everything?
Yeah. So you can totally test everything. I have a feeling that your team will have some like gut instinct about what might be the most important things to test. We talk a lot about prioritization in a backlog of work, and I think you can prioritize experiments the same way, right? So in a photo that I shared, we had sort of those winners and losers. We had another column that was like experiment backlog, and every week, instead of doing a story writing session, we would do like an experiment brainstorming session. with our team. And so we would just fill out as many of those experiment plans as possible and then prioritize those into a backlog, just like you would if you were working on a product that wasn't using experiment-driven design.
Next question is, what advice do you have on rapidly designing landing pages when you're exploring different parts of the Lean canvas?
Oh, cool. You know, I think people spend, particularly in this day and age, a lot of time on landing pages. They create, you know, like you see ones with beautiful, beautiful animations and transitions. You see ones where people have created like custom video and custom graphics that clearly someone has spent a lot of time on. I think doing it the like scrappy way is best. You know, if you have a template and you can just sort of fill in colors, photos, and icons as fast as you can with that, I think is the best. With these tests, the goal, especially with the landing page, the goal is to see you know, if it's going to convert or if it's going to solve the problem of your users. And most likely a very rich, beautiful video or graphic is not going to be like the most cost-effective way to learn that if it does that. And so I would really promote doing things as scrappy and as quickly as you can.
Thanks. We have a few questions that are a little bit similar here. So the first one is, do you need to have engineers involved during these experiments? What if you don't have engineering resources available? Also, if engineers are involved, how does that work?
Cool. So if you don't have engineers involved and you yourself don't have the skill set to sort of like ship a digital product, I think you can learn so much from qualitative and prototype testing. You know, we've done landing page tests where we've made a usertesting.com test. Like you can set up a test with many screens and tested many different landing pages and concepts out that way and just gathered the qualitative feedback. So if you don't have engineers, I think finding rapid ways to get as much qualitative feedback as you can is super important, and being as sort of inventive in those ways as you can be. If there are engineers involved, obviously you have more options of what you can test and how. And like I mentioned, some tools, things like Amplitude and that can assist your engineers in sort of deploying and understanding these types of multivariant tests. Also, I think it's really important for engineers to be involved in every step of the process too, if they're on your team, right? So they should be helping you fill out the Lean Canvas and reflecting with you just as much as any other discipline.
Awesome. And the last question that we have here is, have you noticed any trends when it comes to what kind of experiments end up being successful and which ones don't?
That's so interesting. In certain projects, as you learn more, I think you can identify and make little wagers on what experiments you think will do better than others. Overall, like cross project, since we work with so many different types of products or industries, I would say overall, not really. You know, if you Google it, things will come up. You know, it'll tell you that like red buttons convert more than blue buttons or whatnot, and people sort of experiments that they've done. I don't personally buy into that more than, you know, any other school of thought. I think for your product and your brand, after launching a couple of tests, you will be able to start seeing trends and identifying patterns. But it will take you a little while to sort of start seeing those things emerge. Also, you know, I've been on projects where we found that, you know, like we found one thing was really, really successful, and then we would launch one experiment in a certain context, and that same type of UI pattern would fail miserably. And so as long as you're tracking your learnings and you're really analyzing them from many perspectives, I think you can understand why those things are happening when experiments that you think might succeed do surprise you and actually don't perform as well.
Awesome. So thank you, Treyce, for all of those answers and for presenting for us today. We're going to wrap up now. Thank you again, everyone, for joining.